Shalom, this is a Beak back with another edification. I want to thank all of my subscribers. I wish all of my subscribers high health and high spirits, and I want to wish that all of my subscribers are safe and your loved ones are protected against these agendas that are waged against us here behind enemy lines here in America. This is Zechariah 11:5. It says, whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty, and they that sell, they say, blessed be the Lord, for I am rich, and their own shepherds pity them not. Talking about the so-called black Latinos and Native Indians, men, children, and women. All right, how these so-called so-called whites kill us daily and hold themselves not guilty over here in America, here behind enemy lines. Okay. This is about the Edomites and the history of the police. Okay. The police, the modern day race soldiers of America. All right. These so-called whites have organized against the so-called black, Latino, Native American Indians, okay? The children of Israel. They've consulted with each other and they have formed a confederacy against the non-whites, all right, over here in America. So I want to get into the history of the police. There's plenty of YouTube channels now with slave patrols, right? The police still running around apprehending non-whites the same way that they used to, okay? If I can show this image, I don't even know if I have it. Let me see, available right now. Let me see if I can find it. Okay, these are the dogs, so I'm gonna come back to these dogs, all right? We have the slave patrol here on Wikipedia, okay? And I wanna read about the slave patrol. Or better known as the police here behind enemy lines, okay? It says slave patrols, also known as patrollers, paddy rollers, or paddy rollers, were organized groups of armed men who monitored and enforced discipline upon slaves in the antebellum United States southern states. The slave patrol's function was to police, all right, police slaves, especially those who escaped or were viewed as defiant. And today in 2025, they do the same thing. The police did not take an oath to uphold the Constitution like the military, like myself, the veterans did. We took oaths to uphold the Constitution, and the police usually are there to uphold the laws or the codes and the color of law that's imposed on the people as an extension of the government, whether it's local, state level, or federal government, all right? Now, the police are actually assigned to the states, all right? Now it says here, what is the origin of police in slavery? The origins of modern day policing can be traced back to the slave patrol. The slave patrol, all right? The earliest formal slave patrol was created in the Carolinas in the early 1700s with one mission: to establish a system of terror and squash slave uprisings with the capacity to pursue, apprehend, and return runaway slaves to their owners. All right, and it goes back to Zechariah 11:5. It says, whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty, and they that sell, they say, blessed be the Lord, for I am rich, and their own shepherds pity them not. Because the so-called blacks are the main group racially here in America behind enemy lines that are suffering under the oppression or under the oppression of the or under the superiority of the so-called whites, which are the Edomites of the Bible. Okay, so I have a history book here in front of me, right? And just to show you just to show you it's the same thing going on today as it was back in the day. You have here the dogs from the movie with Will Smith. It's a slave movie. I forget the name of the movie. But after Will Smith slapped Chris Rock on stage, it seems as his career took a hit. And this movie that he came out with was a slave movie, one of his worst films besides 0 Degrees of Separation, where he exposed himself as a elemental P in 0 Degrees of Separation. But this slave movie is in black and white, has some actors in there that I'm familiar with, but that's neither here or there. The dogs in the movie are the same dogs that are used today, all right? The same dogs in the civil rights movement on screen right here. There goes the civil rights movement. A cop is allowing the dog to bite one of our forefathers, one of our ancestors, right? All right? And this is in the 60s, right? And then here goes the same dogs that were in the movie, in the slave movie with Will Smith, okay? So I'm reading, I have a Bible in front of me, a King James Version Bible, and I also have this chronological timeline of history here in America behind enemy lines with a lot of articles from the newspapers that recorded a lot of these so-called whites killing so-called blacks. So here goes one article. It says, take notice, Quebec 14th colony with a question mark. Well, actually, it says kidnappers menace free blacks in Pennsylvania. It says kidnappers are at work among us. They are stealing black people who have been freed and selling them back into slavery. All right, this is Pennsylvania. It says a free black community has been growing in recent years due largely to Quaker emancipation efforts. All right, it says, but almost simultaneously, scavengers, so-called whites, have begun their vile kidnapping. All right, kidnapping, right? It says they have no respect for humanity or freedom, talking about the so-called whites, and would have continued unchecked until concerned Quakers organized the Pennsylvania Abolition Society to protect free blacks and attempt to save those unlawfully held in bondage. The society began its work in 1775, but present hostilities have forced a suspension of its activities, and our people are once again in danger. All right, in danger. All right, Salakia, I got something in my eye. Salakia. All right, Salakia. Okay, so it says here, let me see. Oh, Salakia. It says here, and I'm going to read a couple of these articles. That was one article, says kidnappers menace free blacks. Okay, all right. It says here, there's another article that says, let me see. Crispus first killed. Okay, this seems to be some type of labor, a group of slaves, so-called blacks. All right, it says here, Crispus first killed. The first man killed was Crispus Attucks, black merchant seaman and an escaped slave. He was at the front of the crowd that taunted the redcoat barbarians, calling them lobsters and bloody backs. According to an eyewitness, Crispus threw himself in and made a blow at the officer with a long cordwood stick. After that, he turned around and struck the grenadiers gun at the captain's right hand and immediately fell in with his club and knocked the gun away. It was shortly after this that the grenadiers shot and killed Crispus. So here we go. All right. And they're holding themselves not guilty, like Zechariah 11:5 states, because the so-called whites were the slave catchers and the judges, and slavery was legal back then. All right. Here goes another article. Escaped slave being captured. The uneasiness of many true patriots about the trade and the desire to boycott the Redcoats convinced the Continental Congress in October of 74 to pass the following resolution. After the first day of December, next we will wholly discontinue the slave trade and will neither be concerned in it ourselves, nor will we hire our vessels, talking about the ships, nor sell our commodities of manufacturers to those concerned in it. Georgia at first absolutely refused to obey, but she was boycotted along with England and soon gave in. Okay, so again, we can go into Deuteronomy 28 and 68, but the Bible from the beginning to the end is about the Hebrew Israelites and their relationship with their God, Yahweh, all right, and how our people were casted away into slavery for disobeying our Most High God, Yahweh, all right. It says slave owning attacked. Virginia is one of the leaders in the first, or Salakia, leaders, one of the first leaders in the fight against the trade at a Fairfax, Virginia County Convention proclaimed in 74 that we wish to see an entire stop forever put to such a wicked, cruel, and unnatural trade. Benjamin Franklin, currently on a secret diplomatic mission in Paris, calls the trade a detestable commerce. Okay, so these so-called whites used to be divided on what to do with us. All right. Again, there's plenty of articles in this book depicting what took place with what took place historically. All right, historically, with so-called slaves, so-called black slaves here in America behind enemy lines. Here goes one more article. It says, Washington slave eludes capture. February 1793, a female slave of President Washington's has escaped to New Hampshire, and it does not seem likely that she will be returned to her illustrious owner. The president, talking about President George Washington, he owned slaves, right? All right, so-called white man, the devil. It says the president, it seems, sent a messenger to New Hampshire's Governor Gilman requesting her capture. See, so the president was a part of this too. He was a damn devil too. The president, it seems, sent a messenger to New Hampshire, but the governor neglected a fair opportunity to arrest her and even put her out of reach of her pursuers. Okay, the account was taken from the lips of the slave woman herself, who is now living in New Hampshire. Other sources reveal that His Excellency sent a letter to Mr. Whipple, the collector of Portsmouth, describing the fugitive and particularly expressing the desire of her mistress, Mrs. Washington, for her return. Fearing a public outcry, however, he cautioned the collector. I do not mean, however, by this request that such violent measures should be used as would excite a mob or riot, which might be the case if she has adherents or even uneasy sensations in the mind of well-disposed citizens, rather than either of these should continue. Okay, so again, lots of history between the so-called whites and the so-called blacks during this slave trade. All right, this commerce of humans. All right, now this picture right here is one of the slaves in the movie with Will Smith refused to continue evading these slave catchers. slave catchers here in the picture, you can see they have these dogs. And that's a so-called black man right there. All right, so-called black people helped so-called whites catch slaves, kind of earning their taste of freedom. Freedom is another form of bondage. All right, this so-called black man right here with his dog is not free. He's just exercising his liberties. But this so-called white man right here is the actual overseer. Okay, and he's the leader of this slave patrol. So they always recruited so-called black Latino Native Indians like they did with the Buffalo Soldiers. The Buffalo Soldiers were another group of bonded men that were helping so-called whites conquer these lands of America and push the Native Indians off their lands so that the so-called whites can conquer these lands and apprehend whatever minerals and precious metals that were underneath these lands and refuse to give them back. Per 2025, we're still witnessing this so-called white man with this land out here, and he has his machinery working the crops now, since slavery is illegal now, where they have these ICE police going around catching all these undocumented immigrants, which would be the cheap labor to work these lands. But these lands are still in possession by the people that own slaves. All right, I wouldn't put it past driving past one of these lands, one of these farms, one of these plantations, and seeing these so-called whites out there with their machines working these crops. If it wouldn't be, it would be a no-brainer to pull over and be like, how long have y'all owned this land? Since the what, 1700s? Since the what, 1600s? Yeah, y'all, I'm pretty sure they used to own slaves if they still possess this land. Large acres of land that are still growing cotton, peanuts, collard greens, tobacco, sweet potatoes. They're still out here, all right? And these families that own slaves still possess these lands, okay? They just don't have slaves waking up every morning, getting out there picking these crops. So the so-called whites are doing it with their John Deeres and with all their big ass machinery, all right? So I thought this was interesting because, you know, I see YouTube channels with the police catching so-called blacks. The blacks are on probation. The blacks are trying to avoid going back to jail. They might be riding dirty. Riding dirty is another term like having guns and drugs and contraband, all types of illegal stuff in the vehicle. So these dogs show up sniffing the vehicles, and these slave patrols are doing the same thing. A lot of citizens here in America that get pulled over, the police are not your friend. The police work for the state, and they're going around like accusers. They're your accusers, okay? They work for the state. They do not uphold the Constitution, all right? They're actually in violation of your rights, all right? Now, the dogs, this is what that's all I was talking about. The dogs are the same dogs that they use today. The K9 dogs, same slave patrollers, all right? This is Zechariah 11:5. It says, whose possessors hold them, or Salakia, whose possessors slay them and hold themselves not guilty, and they that sell, they say, blessed be the Lord, for I am rich, and their own shepherds pity them not. Talking about the shepherds of the so-called black Latino Native American Indians. Now I'm going to go here to Deuteronomy chapter 28 and 68, the famous slave trade verse, all right, which if I can get to it in a second, 28 and 68, it says, and the Lord shall bring thee into Egypt again with ships, talking about America, modern day America, by the way whereof I spake unto thee, thou shalt see it no more again. All right, referring to our homeland, and there ye shall be sold unto your enemies for bondmen and bondwomen, and no man shall buy you. In these articles, a lot of Quakers try to organize against the kidnapping of the slaves that were actually considered free, but still they lost that fight, and these so-called blacks made deals over and over again with the so-called whites, and they found themselves back in slavery. All right, here we are today in 2025, still bond men and bond women. All right, but it's just voluntarily. All right, all these jobs. And that's what so-called blacks want. They want jobs and Jesus. Jobs, Jesus, and drugs and food. And you can pretty much guarantee that these so-called blacks will be slaves for another 1,000 years. All right, so the plan has always been to keep so-called black, Latino, Native Indians as slaves. And the slave catchers have always been the police. All right, see, he's a police officer right there. The police have historically been race soldiers, all right? Race soldiers. The word trooper, all right? Trooper, all right, like state trooper, all right? Let's go here to trooper real quick, and then I'm gonna get out of here. Trooper, come on. Let's go to trooper, horse, soldier in cavalry, troop. All right. It says extended to mounted policemen. All right. It says then to state policemen, troop. So the state troopers were the ones waiting across the bridge in Selma when Martin Luther King was marching and they got tear gassed and beat. Right. The state troopers acting as race soldiers. Okay. Hopefully somebody's been edified. This has been a Beak. Back with another edification. I want to thank all of my subscribers, all 203 of my subscribers. I want to wish that my subscribers and your loved ones are safe and protected and in high spirits, safe and protected against these agendas that are waged against us here behind enemy lines here in America. This has been a Beak. I want to say Shalom.